Hasnul, Bu Menarni, and also Mbak Mundi, my senior. It must be the first, yeah. But okay. To be honest, it is something like menggarami lautan. Yeah? I'm talking about the Islamic transnational writing to a group of experts from the Islamic studies. But probably I'll try to do something from outside as the observer, probably, because my main focus, as who Ina said, is about critical and media studies, not in really in the literary studies. But let's try to do what I can contribute in these discussions. Okay, may I share my, sorry, wait for a second. Okay, okay, in this occasion, then I try to look at it a bit distant from what is supposed to be transnational writing or literature. So I want to start a little bit back further by talking about how to reimagine the notion of nations through this transnational literature. So the question, of course, in the knowledge building is whether it is an adequate rival explanations from the one that we usually do, or from the existing approach that we have today. So, okay, then there are at least 3 themes that I want to address. The first one is by understanding how the English literary department developed, then we will know the idea from the early on at the beginning of this department that there was an idea to relate literary work with nations. And the second one, why do we need a notion of transnational literature in this case? And whether then this notion can give us an alternative approach. Okay, I'm not just a beginner, to confess, so probably I will use the definition by Paul J. in 2001. The book, the title is Transnational Literature, the basics, a very basic one. So sorry for this one. Okay, as of course, Bu Hasnul is the expert for this one. So as Bu Hasnul says, there is an idea, the development from post-colonial, then world literature, and then now transnational literature. So what is going on here? In general, transnational literature then is about literary productions, circulations, and also receptions. But as Bu Hasnul said, it occurs in liminal spaces. Liminal spaces mean probably if we have a diagram fan, then we suppose semantically there are two circles, then between the two is the liminal spaces. And there is border zones. So it is about mobility, about migrancy, about hybrid identities, and so on. I think you are quite familiar with this one from your previous lecture, probably. So, as usual, when the scholars think about something new, so there are 2 ideas. Whether we want to talk this transnational literature as a descriptive one, as Bu Hasnul said, or we may also think this as a field of study, as a certain framework to think or to rethink what is going on in literary work. Probably I will try to do the second one because, as I said, to be honest, I'm not an expert in transnational literature field of studies. But how this field of studies or a certain framework can give us something new as a post-colonial initiative by Edward Said and so on. What is the development and whether it is quite strong to give us new understanding. Okay, and who are the writers of this genre? As Hasnul said, it is a new generations, culturally mobile writers who lived in two different places, experience cultural dislocations by intention or not, and then also they are usually very they are also immersed themselves in many multiple cultures and territories and different geographical locations and so on. And they are usually very fluent in two languages or probably more than two. Is plurilingual. They have plurilingual abilities in language. So usually they are also highly educated to some extent, probably not, but at the beginning, but then they pursue their higher educations in the European or in, American university. Okay, or they live there as the part of diasporic communities. Okay, why is it important then? The question is, of course, why we should focus on this new phenomenon, why we should focus on this one. Okay, to go back, then usually if we are learning English literature, so there is traditionally, we don't take care too much about theory or conceptual framework. So also the very typical questions, for example, we can see something like this one. What fairies means does John Keats achieve intensity of emotion and sensation in his poetry? This very common question probably in your prose, poetry courses. Then what we may argue here that this take it for granted that we agree that the romantic poet, for this case John Keats, have intensity of emotion and sensations. Yeah. So the question is, who states that a poem achieves certain intensity and emotion? We rarely discuss this. We achieve it. We take it for granted. Also, if we are going to UK system, then when we are applying for university level, then we have to do advanced level in English, for example. It's very typical question is also quite the same. Say, for example, like this one. States that, blah, 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 states that Keats' real qualities are strong thought, direct apprehensions of beauty and vivid concrete imagery and so on. Choose one of these qualities and discuss it. It seems that it is natural, these questions, as it is. But in fact, if we study further and try to investigate what is in the questions in more detail, then it is something cultural than the natural. This is what I want to argue. So if we look at why it is important to study transnational literature, because in the existing approach that we are doing now is very common, then we accept it, take it for granted. It's normal to think very theoretical framework as something natural. Okay, why is that so? Because there is a presuppositions, what we call it in general as the Leavis method, the way how Leavis in UK try to approach literary work. At least there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You may read it by yourself, but at least in general, we think that literary work has a mission we are teaching this to humanize people out there, and we can approach it in objective way. And the most important thing is your sensibility, and the most common method is practical criticism, using a very intrinsic way of thinking that there are literary work as an independent or autonomous system, and we use a close reading to some extent, not close reading in the Derridian sense, of course. Okay, then in such presupposition, of course, studying English literature, it seems objective, not something, not in case that it is not about studying someone as culture, or there are, and it is not thought in terms of aesthetics, yeah, beauty and so on. This is very general and universal. Then let's see what is going on. In fact, if we try to look at the historical development of English literature, as we know, the first English department was not established in Britain, but in India in 19th century, as we know, yeah. And of course, because in the colonial period, the aim of the department not to enlighten people, in fact, but it is to make the population, Indian people at the time, to be moral. Moral here is meant if understood in rather narrow sense of being an agreement with the principle of the East India Company. But many people in London thought it was quite risky, persuading someone to become a Christian. So what we can do, what should we do then? So they promoted literature of England as a way of molding people to know the English way of life, moral, taste, the English way of doing things. So in general, studying English literature at the beginning was seen as a way of civilizing the native populations. Yeah, of course, two centuries ago. Yeah. Okay, then in the beginning of 20th century, then this idea was back to Britain by then the thinker name is Matthew Arnold thought that it was also important to re-civilize native savages in England, in Britain. Yeah, so brought it back to England. Of course, we may argue it is just one perspective, and we know that the first English department is at the University of London, not in Cambridge. Yeah, okay. But in general, this idea was the dominant one, that literary work is used to re-civilize people out there to understand Britishness or the British value. Okay. So in general, also studying there is another writer, John Curtin Collins, then wrote a very polemical book, Study of English Literature at the beginning of 20th century. It is moral and aesthetic educations. We still remember that literary work is pseudo-science and pseudo-religion. It is not dogmatic, but it is also to some extent a science. Okay. So the case study too, also in Indonesian, modern Indonesian literature, it was taught to begin at the beginning of 20th century by the establishment of Balai Pustaka. Yeah. Okay. But in fact, it's quite the same. But it's different in case that in East Indian Company, they use English as a medium in instructions, but VOC prefers to use Malay words, yeah, with some reasons and considerations. But the aim the aims were quite the same. Okay, then as Bu Hasnul probably ever said, or Bu Mundi Ika said, but that in 1980s or 1990s, then there was a post-colonial idea initiated by Edward Said. Then there is also a challenge, rival explanations about this, that in fact, what is called by Indonesian literature, it has always been marked by the continuing process of translation, not just in European perspective, but also narrative importations, genre shifts, and adaptations from throughout East Asia, Indian subcontinent, Arabia, and Europe, of course. So if the idea that Balai Pustaka is just primarily cultural and positive, as Pak Tewi said, it is not quite the case, yeah, because in general also Balai Pustaka selected certain literary work to publish. Okay. Okay. Then if we are using, then now I try to use it back for our own situations, yeah, for the student probably, because you may not experience live into different countries, but how to think this transnational literature for our own situations, yeah. If now I am by writing back, but now reflecting back transnational for us, what are at issues? Now Islam becomes so central here. Okay, let's see the hot debates, for example, in 2015 or 16 around this one. Amina Tyler, 90-year-old Tunisian woman, yeah, joining Fairman, yeah, or Fairman, yeah. Usually they did a protest by topless in the public life. Yeah. So when Amina did this and said that go away with your morality, it is my own body, then there are many supporters in Europe for this one. Yeah. But what is at issue for us here as the activists, for the scholars to think about feminisms? So in fact, by using transnational literature, we can think that no universality in the term of liberations. What is so common then in European perspective or in the Western perspective about religions? I would call it as bad manners. What it means that they try to impose their own framework to other people's life. So what we can do here, probably we may see Mbak Sarah Sultana from Labour Party, elected as the members of parliament in English, said in his in her Twitters, I'm a proud Muslim, I do not need liberating, I don't appreciate being used to reinforce, this is a very important one, Western imperialism. You don't represent me. So there is a dilemma, of course, when we face with this global force, whether we want to, we want to involve, but we must be critical in this sense. How we don't perpetuate what we are criticizing. And Zara Sultana said, I'm a Muslim and it's okay with this one. Okay, but then we will discuss later on what is the consequence. Of course, there are many people at the time attacking her, but she said, no, I don't need that, such kind of liberations because we have certain way of thinking. What it is then? Okay, so I borrow from Talal Asad 2015. how we think the different kind of ideas about traditions, religion, and politics as practice. This is very important approach for me, I think. So in this case, then, and we want to argue against the global Western idea, whether it is what we call is as the dominance idea about way of thinking and life, then we may say to argue that religion, tradition, and politics as practice in two terms. The first one as the embodiment of day-to-day life, and the second one as the empirical arrangement, the way how we are as a social practice, in the way how we are in day-to-day range our life. So Islam is not the abstract concept out there, but Islam is tradition in terms of the two things, our embodiment in our everyday activities, and the second one, the way how we deal with the empirical reality out there, how we organize our life, whether it is our thinking and material things. Okay. So by arguing using day-to-day life is the one thing that we can do, and an important and strong argument. Okay, then say, for example, sometimes if in the logic either modernity or traditions, yeah, or either West or East, so there is only one solutions. But in fact, in real life, what we do, the logic is not either or, but is both and. So in general life, we can find young students at many universities. They are pious, highly educated, and also trendy. So it is your turn to answer why or why not. So we may see the way how someone, it is, I taken this undertaken by Ibu Evi Eliana for the book written by Pak Arya Herianto. Someone using a jilbab in Malang is very easy and not, it's okay, yeah, to be a fans of Korean pop stars, for example. So also, so pious to some extent is also highly educated and also trendy. Okay, so both and logic is possible in real life. Okay, so back to Islam. In fact, it is not a kind of philosophy as it is understood by philosophers or theologians, but it is reconfiguring or creating someone to something, or we can say reconfiguring Muslim. As Talal Asad's interview with Sheikh Usama commented that we say al-amal bin niyat. So of course it's based on our intentions and how this intention creates social justice, because the constitutions of niyat by behavior, our behavior and verbal actions take place in various contexts and social life. And Sheikh Usama, I think, sorry to say this one, it's like menggarami lautan. Yeah? So, but I will try to say this. He went on to talk about the education of good character. Of course, it's very important, tahdib al-akhlaq. So akhlaq is what adab is, solely is the most important in Islam. Through the practices of devotions, yeah, rukun Islam and discipline, but insisted that the ethical formations of the individual was not a matter for individual person, but it took place through interactions among people and things in several social locations, households, school, mosques, media, and the state. So when we are confessing as a Muslim, it is not just a problem of discursive thinking, but it's embodiment in some sense. We are doing and practicing Islam in everyday life with the al-amr bil ma'ruf nahi munkar, amal ma'ruf nahi munkar, something like this one. It's very common, but not only in Islam, but also I think in a Christian. But in Shariat, it is strengthened, this amar ma'ruf nahi munkar. So then what I want to argue is, by using our thinking and reading transnational literature, whether it is strong enough to argue against the dominance idea and teaching and value in English literature, how can we do it? And we should reflect in our own nations. And by such, for example, is what Talal Assets argue. And in Indonesia, for example, it is the one that we need to study further. In fact, there was a practice from V.S. Rendra. Sorry, I'm not translating this in English because I think the word here is very strong and I think is very close to us when it is written in the nation's language. So in fact for Rendra, bermain drama di atas panggung itu adalah bukan tujuan utama bengkel teater. Tetapi reconfiguring, as I said, embodiment and discursivity both are important. So menggembleng akal sehat, hati nurani, dan integritas pribadi. So drama for Rendra is not to perform; it's just part of it. But in the focus, in fact, is try to redevelop ourselves. So melalui kurikulum musim hujan, misalkan di tahun 1970-an barangkali, unsur akal sehat dimanifestasikan dalam pelajaran logika, sementara integritas pribadi melalui pelajaran antropologi budaya, sejarah dan kebudayaan, bahasa Inggris, teknologi implementer, sains populer. Sedang hati nurani di dalam bengkel teater diasah melalui pengalaman kebatinan, improvisasi, dan pencaksilat. Both are in curriculum, not like in my department, for instance. I'm just talking about discursive things, not the embodiment of literary work to redevelop you into someone that I'm expecting. Okay, so now to conclude, it is a questions rather than a statement. So how to reground literary studies beyond metropolitanism? I mean by thinking either or, as I said before, between East and West. And because to some extent, if we look at the situation in Iran or in Afghanistan, in Syria and other places in this world, then sometimes this idea of post-colonial used by the authoritarian regime to some extent to banish multiple perspective there. And what we mean by a multiple perspective here, can we develop multiculturalism or other things? So we should be back to our own teaching. Then this is I think Islam is one of the answer. So your position now is very important to provide an answer how to reground the English literary studies or literary studies in general by building certain ways of knowing, knowledge, technological way, how to go beyond metropolitanism and a tendency to be nativism. I mean to be original, asli. Ini yang asli, itu yang tidak, and something like this. So how to move beyond this? Of course, Islam, I think, is very perspective to provide an answer. I cannot give you a very short answer because it is your task as a student and future scholars probably then to reformulate what we are going to do. Okay, I think that's all what I want to say. Hopefully you may find something useful, then we may discuss together. If I cannot answer, then there is Pak Husni Tamrin, Bu Ina, Bu Hasnul, Bu Mundi, my senior, probably will elaborate further. Thank you so much, Bu Ina. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.